Today we're going to have a fun chat about an evil, power-hungry pirate who may be trying to do dark magic rituals in an attempt to ascend to godhood, and how he may be being manipulated by someone who is strapped up to a weirwood tree and, depending on how you look at it, may in fact be a god himself. I am, of course, talking about Euron and Bloodraven, and we're even going to talk about how Bloodraven may have also been manipulating Bran into becoming his replacement, all while Bran has no idea what he's actually signed up for and why that might be important. So this one is a pretty big theory and deals directly with the endgame of A Song of Ice and Fire, so there's going to be a little setup we need to do first. One of the key things to understand is just how much Norse mythology inspiration has gone into the world building of A Song of Ice and Fire. We've covered a lot of this on the channel before, how the heart trees as a big system seem to be interconnected and seem to function basically like the world tree did in Norse mythology. They used to sacrifice people to the world tree in just the same way that people are sacrificed to the heart trees. In addition to this, there's the idea of Ragnarok, where the realms of ice and fire meet and destroy the world, and basically all of the gods die along with most of the people, and as the world is destroyed, it leaves the few survivors to emerge into a new world reborn, and then the cycle begins again. The other thing that seems to be going on in A Song of Ice and Fire is that the Weirwoods seem to be a giant hive mind that is basically manipulating and controlling everyone. All of society, at least the Northman society, the old gods society, is all built around the worship of the heart trees and very specifically making human sacrifice to the heart trees. They hang entrails up in the heart trees, they leave babies out in the woods or throw them down wells where I have speculated with what I think is pretty good evidence that all of those babies end up being fed to the weirwood trees. It would seem that the old gods are essentially these weirwood trees or the hive mind that inhabits them, or if you want to put it this way, you could say the old gods are the green seers who are strapped up to the weirwood trees who are taking actions in the world on behalf of the weirwoods. So, with that in mind, that we have seen one character who may himself be at this point the manifestation of the old gods in the world, and Bran himself seems to be on a path where he could end up being the next version of that. Actually, Euron's idea that he could eventually ascend to godhood is maybe not that crazy of an idea. It's already potentially happened once in our story and may happen again. It's just probably not Euron that it's going to happen to. What makes this all kind of interesting, though, is the fact that Euron is very strongly hinted to be connected to Bloodraven, and potentially has been a former student of Bloodraven, so maybe he has very good reason to suspect that he could eventually one day become a god. This, however, brings us to where we have to start taking a long look at Bloodraven. And if you do that, the first thing you're going to realize about Bloodraven is that he is a manipulative liar, who will basically say or do whatever he thinks is what's required to get to what he views as the greater good. For some examples of his lies, you can just take a look at before he was strapped up to the tree, how he would use glamours to pretend to be someone else in order to spy and gain information, or for an example of how he just does whatever it takes to get the end result he wants, you can take a look at the moment where he called a great council and promised Aenys Blackfire that he could participate in the council, and then as soon as he arrived in King's Landing, Bloodraven had him killed. He wanted to get rid of the Blackfires, and so he lied and eventually got rid of the Blackfires. Now, this is a very dishonorable action, and it's actually the thing that got him sent to the wall in the end, because you can't have a person who is a representation of your government basically just lying and murdering people when he promises them safe passage. That's not going to inspire much trust in the office of the Hand of the King. So, Bloodraven is sent off to the wall, and he has to continue his manipulation and lies from there. And eventually he disappears in the north and is not seen for quite a long time until he eventually pops up as being the three-eyed crow who was recruiting Bran to the cave. And it really does start getting interesting when you look at just how Bran was tricked into going to that cave. Even when he wakes up from the dream, he thinks that the crow tricked him into flying, and he woke up and the world was changed. And old Nan says to him that crows are all liars, which is maybe something that he should have heeded a little bit more strongly. Because let's remember, the entire time that Bran is going north, he actually thinks that on some level or another, this magical person is going to fix his legs. He gets to the cave and he asks Bloodraven if he can fix his legs, and Bloodraven just says, "Nope, that's beyond my powers. You'll never walk again, but you will fly." By this, he basically means that Bran will one day be strapped into the Weirwoods just like Bloodraven is, and that he will gain all the power of being a Greenseer. If Bran had known that this was what he was signing up for, essentially spending an eternity in a dark cave, would he have actually gone north? Who really knows? But what is very clear is that Bran was manipulated into this position by the visions that were sent by Bloodraven. Also, I am aware that there's good reason to suspect the Three-Eyed Crow could potentially be time-traveling Bran himself, and that Bloodraven is doing all of this just working as an agent of the Weirwoods or the Three-Eyed Crow, but it would make things a little bit more complicated if I kept bringing that up all the time throughout the video, so I'm basically calling Bloodraven the Three-Eyed Crow for this purpose, but again, it could just be that he's doing all this working for the Crow, I do acknowledge that. So if you want to think time-traveling Bran is the one manipulating everyone in the end, you can definitely think that, and this theory should still basically work. All you have to accept is that Bloodraven is basically also being manipulated by the Crow, or being shown what to do by the Crow or the Weirwoods. So, with that disclaimer out of the way, one of the things that I think is pretty interesting about all of the time that Bloodraven has been in charge as a Greenseer and has been up there in that cave is all of that time the wall seems to be getting closer to falling, the others seem to be getting stronger, and the end times seem to be getting closer. Given how much power Bloodraven seems to have and the ability that he seems to have to manipulate pretty much anyone by sending them dreams, if his goal was on any real level to slow down the others or stop them entirely or anything like that, well, he probably could have done a lot more to at least keep them away than he's been doing so far. But instead, the Night's Watch has basically completely deteriorated under his watch, and the others seem to be in perfect position to eventually sweep over the Seven Kingdoms. Now, this situation kind of implies that Bloodraven is either evil and working towards the destruction of humanity, or in some way the others coming back and this cycle of rebirth that may be happening if you take Norse mythology as the inspiration for A Song of Ice and Fire. The rebirth by ice and fire in the style of Ragnarok is maybe actually in some way or another what the world needs. And if you look at the way that the world has worked for Westeros for, thousands and thousands of years, you can kind of actually see why maybe it would be a good thing if all of the old gods were to die and the world were to be reborn by a cycle of ice and fire. Because at this point, all of humanity is essentially locked into a system where they have to worship and feed blood to these trees. They have to practice things like the First Night, where essentially their feudal lords get to sleep with their wives and daughters on their wedding nights, and it leads to a bunch of unwanted babies who are all sacrificed. This would be a terrible system to live under, and I have suggested in the past that on some level or another, this entire system keeps people trapped by fear of the others, and that's the only thing that's keeping them living under this terrible system. The old ways and the old gods are brutal and based on human sacrifice, and it would probably be better for society as a whole if you could do away with them. The reason you can't do away with them is, as I have speculated, it seems like the wall is essentially powered by the blood sacrifice to the Weirwoods. The wall seems to be a giant line of Weirwoods, and if you essentially stop feeding them all of the blood, it seems like maybe the magic that protects you from the others would go away, and the others sweep down and destroy everyone. Which is a pretty good system if you are the Weirwoods, because then it locks everyone into essentially worshipping you forever. Hopefully you're still with me, but if you're confused by any of that, I have like an entire playlist that'll be in the end card of this video that I've been putting out for months that breaks this stuff down topic by topic, and I am trying to go quickly here to just get you caught up to speed so this video can stand on its own. It would seem, though, on some level or another, that basically Bloodraven is manipulating the world into a situation where the others are in fact going to return and the wall is probably going to fall. But if this cycle of rebirth is potentially going to lead to the death and destruction of the old gods, and Bloodraven is, as we have said, one of those old gods, why on earth would he want to do this? Now, it could just be potentially that Bloodraven has been strapped up to these trees long enough and has been sustained by the blood sacrifice of enough people's babies to realize that, oh man, this entire system is really evil. But there's actually another, even more selfish potential reason that he could be doing this. When Bran is in Bloodraven's cave and he's warging into Hodor and exploring different caverns, one of the caverns that he finds has a bunch of past Greenseers entwined in the roots like Brynden is. and as he walks past them, he thinks that they're dead until their eyes open and they start to follow him. One of them tries to open its mouth but is unable to speak. And when we see Bloodraven, he is described as basically being entirely taken over by the trees, except for some little small parts of him, including his red eye. Leaf even says that he's barely lingering and hanging on to life, all just for the sake of essentially guiding Bran, and Leaf says it's all for humanity, which I think does actually track on some level, that Bloodraven is doing this because in the end this is going to be better for humanity, but it is also pretty convenient how, at the end of his time in power, he is potentially setting up a scenario where this whole system could be ended. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? Well, that's where we have to get into what exactly Bloodraven is manipulating everyone into doing, and why Bran is very specifically being shielded from all of the dark actions that are required for him to take this power as a Greenseer. Because there was that whole theme in the end of the television show where maybe the person who is most suited for power is the one who doesn't actually want it. And when you take that into consideration for how Bran is being manipulated, that seems to be what is lined up here. Bran doesn't actually want the power that he is being put into. Whereas past Greenseers may have had to seek out this power and do all sorts of dark things to ascend to godhood, Bran is having all of those things done for him unknowingly, and he might end up in a situation where he wants to reject this power that he all of a sudden finds himself with. And by doing that, he could potentially be the only one capable of actually ending this system. Because if the system is incredibly powerful, the only person who may be able to end it is the person who's in charge of all of it. And normally you don't get someone in charge of all of it unless they themselves are power hungry and want to use the power. Bran could be being manipulated into being an exception to this rule. So, what dark things exactly is Bran having to do that he is doing unknowingly? Well, this comes down to a little bit of fan speculation, but it is a couple of theories that I think are incredibly well founded and almost certainly true. The first one is a very popular one known as Jojen paste, which, if you just do a quick search around on YouTube, you'll find plenty of good videos talking about the idea of Jojen paste. You'll notice that this theory is roughly like 15 theories in a trench coat, and Jojen paste is one of them, so I will keep it brief here, but basically Jojen has known the moment he's going to die, he's been shown it in green dreams, and as soon as they get to the cave, Jojen starts to be really, really sad, and says things like, Bran's not the one who needs to be worried, implying that maybe someone else in the group is the one who needs to be worried. And then there's this whole ceremony where Bran has to eat this weirwood paste that he looks at and thinks, man, this really looks like human blood. Bran is told that eating this paste will help awaken his gifts and wed him to the trees, but the thing about the weirwood trees is they definitely eat people for their power. As we've said, the whole Old Ways culture is all built around sacrificing people to the weirwoods, so it would on some level make sense that you might need to eat people or eat their blood in order to essentially gain this power and wed yourself to the trees. And the thing about it is, this isn't even the only time that Bran has probably eaten people, and the other time was also at the direct command of an agent of Bloodraven or Bloodraven himself, all without Bran knowing. I'm talking about the time where Bran and company are traveling north with Cold Hands and they have no food essentially. There's no game anywhere to be found, but then one time Bran wakes up and there's a fire going and there's some meat cooking. Apparently, the ranger had gone off and killed a pig. But the thing about it that fans have noticed is many people apparently say that human meat tastes a lot like pig, and we don't really know where on earth the ranger would have found a pig this far north of the wall. But the one thing that he could have found is the mutineers at Craster's Keep. So it is often speculated, and I think very credibly speculated, that what happened is Cold Hands went off and killed one or many of the mutineers at Craster's Keep, and then he brought back a bunch of the meat and cooked it up for the group to eat so that they would have enough energy to get north to the cave. Now, you could say that he maybe just did this so that they would have the energy to get to the cave where they need to get to in the end, but again, if eating people is something that's important to awakening Bran's powers, well, this is just another situation where he is unknowingly fed some people, perhaps preserving his own innocence, whereas normally someone who was trying to do this would have to intentionally take these dark actions. So, with that being said, what is so potentially useful about the idea of Bran being innocent and completely unaware of and unwilling to take on this power that he may be being given? Well, we get a potential hint to that in a conversation he has with Mira and Jojen, before, Jojen is pastified. The conversation that they have is one where Jojen is essentially talking about what it's going to mean to be a green seer, and then Mira points out that Bran will be around long after all of them are gone as a green seer, and this actually is something that Bran very clearly doesn't want. He doesn't say it out loud because he doesn't want to sound sad or weepy, as he says, but he thinks that he really doesn't want to be around after all of his friends are gone. And that may be important to what Bloodraven wants. Now, there are two reasons for this that we've already briefly touched on. First of all, that Bloodraven is potentially going to be locked into a situation like all of those past Green Seers where he is trapped forever to eternal life, unable to do anything but stare at the side of a dark cave wall. This may not be something that he actually wants. But on the other hand, if you want to give him a more positive motivation for all of humanity, it could be simply the fact that you need someone to ascend to the status of an old god who is in charge of the entire system, who doesn't want it, so that when the time comes, they will actually destroy the thing. So, how exactly is Bloodraven going to get the world into a position where Bran can potentially deal the killing blow to the old gods and sacrifice potentially this power that he has in order to free the world from their control? Well, this is where Euron comes into play. I know we mentioned him in the beginning and then haven't talked about him since, but now we get to talk about how Euron has actually been manipulated by Bloodraven the entire time, and the Crow's Eye may actually be the Crow's puppet. Now, it's a very well-founded fan theory that Euron is actually the former student of Bloodraven. Euron calls himself Crow's Eye, and he has one red eye, which is a match for Bloodraven, who has one red eye. And in addition to this, he talks about dreams he has as a kid, which are basically a mirrored image to the dreams that Bran was getting, where he's basically told that he can fly, but then he wakes up and the Maester says, no, you can't fly, and Euron thinks, well, what if he was wrong? There's definitely enough hints in the books that I am firmly believing that Euron was in fact a former student of Bloodraven. Or at the very least, he has been contacted by Bloodraven or the Three-Eyed Crow in his dreams, and he is following those visions and trying to gain power by doing so. So basically, what you have set up here is two students of Bloodraven who are basically the exact opposite type of person with the exact opposite goals. One who is trying to do all sorts of dark things to take power for themselves, and one who is very innocent and not trying to do any of those dark things and doesn't even seem to want the power anyway. It would seem that Bloodraven may be setting up a sort of good cop, bad cop strategy here, or in this case, good crow, bad crow. He may have been manipulating Euron into thinking he's the one who's going to ascend to godhood as the next in the line of green seers after Bloodraven, and meanwhile he has snuck Bran up to the cave and done all of the rituals to ensure that it will actually be Bran. In addition to this, even though Bran is ascending into this seat of power, Bloodraven needs the old ways ended, and he essentially needs the world to be destroyed so it can be reborn. Well, then Bran, who's an innocent little boy, may not want to actually take the actions needed to, say, bring down the wall and allow the others to sweep over humanity. Well, luckily, Bloodraven has set up Euron to do all of that for him so that Bran is in a situation where all of the stuff is done and he really doesn't have a choice about it. All he has to do is do the right thing when the time comes. Basically, if it is an important part of Bloodraven's plan that Bran maintains his innocence and doesn't want all this power and doesn't take all these dark evil actions, well, then you need someone else out there who is taking all these dark evil actions and bringing about the end of the world, and that could be exactly why Bloodraven has been manipulating Euron. This is where another theory comes into play, one by Company of the Cat, which I find just absolutely perfect. It's the idea that essentially Euron is drinking his shade of the evening and getting these visions and dreams, and he's seeing Jon Snow and he thinks that it's him. Which is pretty hilarious and exactly how you would go about manipulating someone like Euron. The other thing is he may have, when he was younger, been seeing visions of Bran and thinking that the little boy is actually him because, well, they look somewhat similar, and Euron definitely has a strong case of main character syndrome, given that he thinks he's basically a god. So, how do you manipulate someone like that? Well, you show them visions of the main characters doing things and gaining power, and of course, he's going to think that it's all about him. So, you have to have Bran up there, who is definitely still trying to save the world and make everything better, but you definitely need some dark things to be done, like, I don't know, maybe bringing down the wall. So you have someone like Euron, who is definitely evil enough to do that, manipulated into a place where he is conveniently now sailing right towards the town where Sam has potentially brought the Horn of Joramun. Let's remember there was a cache found in the far north where they found some dragon glass daggers and a horn, and if that was hidden by Bloodraven or one of his agents, that would be just another perfect part of his beautiful setup that he's doing for this whole scenario. And the fact that that horn, which could potentially bring down the wall, has ended up in a place where it might be taken by someone who is just the type of person who goes around grabbing magical horns and blowing them, well, that seems just perfect. Euron is the exact type of person who would blow the Horn of Joramun and bring down the wall if he thought that it benefits him. And if he's being manipulated by Bloodraven into thinking all these things benefit him, well then Euron might be the one who brings down the wall, which has been speculated before, but the big difference here is that that's actually all part of Bloodraven's plan. Much like telling Bran that he needs to fly or die when he is already falling towards his own death, once the wall falls, he's just going to be in a position where he has to either do the thing or not, right? All of the pressure is just put on Bran in the same way where he just doesn't have a choice. He has to either fly or die, and in this case, he is going to have to either save the world or not. So let's just take a look now into what might actually have to happen for Bran to save the world. Now, one of the things that we've talked about on the channel before is how the others very much seem to be related to the Weirwoods. And what I've speculated in the past is the fact that they are constantly referred to as white shadows or cold shadows is probably because they are actually just shadows. I've got an entire long video explaining all of that, so if you want to check that out after this, go ahead. But basically what the idea is that there are shadow babies who are cast from the green seers who are strapped up to the weirwood trees, and because they're sustained forever and their life force is sustained by the weirwoods, these shadows are essentially permanent, and that's potentially what we see in the others. Whereas Melisandre is casting fiery fire magic shadows, these seem to be icy shadows made out of mist, and so there is definitely a little bit of a different mechanism going on between this and Melisandre's shadow baby, but everything we see about the others would kind of track with them just being like a magical formation made of frozen mist, and that can be broken when you stab it with dragon glass. That's why when Sam stabs one, it just melts into a puddle, because it is essentially a form held together by magic made out of frozen mist, a misty, icy shadow. That may sound a little bit crazy if you've never heard the idea before, but I assure you there's a lot of clues that George has set up, and with the way that he's set up his shadow magic, it does make sense that this would pretty much work as it's described. If the others are cast from the Weirwoods, I could see it going a few different ways for what you need to do to get rid of them. You either need to send them all back into the trees somehow, or potentially you need to destroy the entire Weirwood system. Now, destroying the Weirwood system, which Bran is going to be strapped up to, might actually be a thing that would cause Bran himself to die. This would also potentially cause the death of all these past green seers like Bloodraven and all of those bodies trapped down in the cave who are trapped there stuck to eternal life. And if those bodies are the thing casting the others, there is some chance that maybe if you destroy those bodies, well then maybe the others go away. So you can sort of see how a situation has been set up where if whoever was at the head of this Weirwood system at the time this happens is someone who wants the power and wants the eternal life, they may be unwilling to do this. But Bran, being the exact opposite of all of that, and specifically not wanting this eternal life, is the exact person who you would want in this position when the time comes. He is going to be the exact type of person who is going to be willing to do what it's going to take to potentially free humanity from this entire system of control, and also free all these bodies of the past Greenseers, including Bloodraven himself, from their eternal prison stuck to a tree, staring at a wall alone in the darkness. Now, if Bran himself is already wed to the trees in some magical way, this could actually cost Bran his own life. This would set Bran up to fulfill one of the most common archetypes of heroes in stories that we have told ourselves going all the way back to the beginning of humanity. The most obvious one you have is probably the story of Jesus, who basically comes down to Earth, is part god and part man, sort of like Bran will be once he's strapped up to the old gods and merged into the hive mind. But then, in order to achieve his goals and essentially save humanity, he has to give up his own life. In addition to that, if you go back a little further, you have the story of Gilgamesh, which has a lot of the similar themes of A Song of Ice and Fire. If this is a story about the old ways ending and new ways taking over that lead humanity to a better place in the end, Well, then that does really sort of mesh with a lot of the themes of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I admit I am not an expert on, so if someone knows more and can correct me on anything I'm about to say down in the comments, definitely do so, and you guys should check the comments for any clarifications on a lot of this stuff. Basically, Gilgamesh is a king who is a king of the new ways for humanity at the time, which was civilization, whereas many of the people were still essentially living as hunter-gatherers or wild men. And Enkidu is the most powerful of all of these wild men. So you have the most powerful of the old ways and you have the most powerful of the new ways, and they come together and they have a big fight, and they realize that they are a match for each other, and then they essentially become friends and go on all sorts of cool adventures. The main goal that Gilgamesh has, however, is to become immortal so that he can be remembered forever as the greatest king because he will just continue to be a king forever. However, in his pursuit of this immortality, basically it causes a bunch of problems and eventually leads to the death of his friend Enkidu. So, then what happens is Gilgamesh realizes that his pursuit is not something he should be going for, and eventually accepts his own death, and, in his later life, he actually becomes an example of a very good king, who, upon his death, his story is told forever to the point where I'm still talking about it today, all these thousands of years later, and it's one of the oldest stories that we still remember. So, his goal was achieved. Only through his acceptance of death did the idea of Gilgamesh become immortal, and he is remembered as a great king. So let's take it now into the modern times, right? We've had 5,000 years ago, we had 2,000 years ago. What about, 10, 20 years ago? Well, take a look at Harry Potter. The entire thing that drives all of Voldemort's evil actions in the story of Harry Potter is his fear of death. He goes around making Horcruxes and basically becomes the most evil wizard of all time, all because he's terrified of his own death. And what does Harry have to do in the end to actually defeat him? Harry has to accept his own death. He has to go into the forest and willingly let Voldemort kill him. And it's only the fact that he does this that in the end allows him to defeat Voldemort and save the world from evil. It's worth noting in Harry Potter, you get to a point in the end where you see Snape confronting Dumbledore, being like, hey, you've been raising Harry the entire time just so that he can die at the proper moment to save the world. And that's basically what's happening. Dumbledore has been manipulating Harry and essentially turning him into the exact type of person who would be willing to make this sacrifice for all of humanity. And that's exactly what Bloodraven seems to be doing with Bran. He is manipulating the exact type of person into the exact position they need to be in so that at the end times they can do the right thing to save humanity. Heck, this is even similar to The Lord of the Rings, how if you have the one ring of power and you give it to someone who is powerful or someone who may use it, well, that's never going to solve the problem. But you can give it to the exact perfect person who is a hobbit who is not going to be completely corrupted by the ring, and in the end, that can lead to the ring's destruction. I know in Lord of the Rings it was more of an accident, but in the end, the fact that Frodo was able to carry this burden all the way to the edge of Mount Doom is the thing that ended up saving humanity. It's because he was the very specific type of person who was able to handle this burden. Returning back to the character of Bran himself, another thing that I think is worth noting and points pretty strongly in this direction is all of the Summer King, Winter King mythology symbolism that is gone into A Song of Ice and Fire. This is something that was pointed out to me by David Lightbringer, who had a video series about this a few years ago at this point. You should definitely go check it out. I'm obviously not going to be able to explain all of it in this video because this is already getting long enough, but the idea is that the Summer King will die in the winter and then be reborn again in the spring. And this is the cycling of the seasons mythology that is so important in A Song of Ice and Fire because obviously the seasons are out of balance. And George has said the seasons will return to balance by the end of the story. This problem has to be fixed. So if Bran is in fact the Summer King as he is so set up symbolically to be, well then it would sort of make sense that deep into the winds of winter, he may die and then be reborn again in the spring. I have also speculated that the heart trees themselves, which function like a world tree, might be also functioning like a heartbeat of the planet, and if it is indeed these heart trees that are acting sort of like a heartbeat of the planet and cycling the seasons, Bran being the Summer King, which is traditionally linked up to the cycling of the seasons, would make sense considering he is getting wed to the trees and sort of merging with them on a magical and mental level. This would sort of give a direct magical connection to the idea of a Summer King and a Winter King and the cycling of the seasons, because the king, who is a summer king, is actually strapped up to the thing that cycles the seasons and needs to actually fix it. So if you take that into account, that the heart trees are probably cycling the seasons and they've been corrupted, which is why the seasons are messed up, well then if the heart trees all need to be destroyed in the long night, you could sort of see a situation where the destruction of the world tree system actually essentially doesn't solve the problem completely, because maybe it does get rid of the others, but now you're stuck with no cycling of the seasons and stuck forever in a long night. This is how the potential rebirth of a new world tree in the middle of the long night, which I've speculated about in the past, could actually eventually solve the problem once and for all, and potentially if Bran is linked to the world tree spirit in some sort of way, maybe it could lead to a rebirth or a resurrection for Bran, giving him that full Jesus archetype. But in any case, right, the idea of rebirthing a new world tree is potentially the thing that could solve this whole problem. Now, how exactly all of our other characters, like Jon and Dany, and all of these other people who may be involved in this end time situation in the Long Night, are going to come together to achieve that is something that I do think I have a pretty solid framework for, but this video is already long enough, so I'm going to cut it off here, and just ask you to like and subscribe so you don't miss that future video. But definitely let me know what you think of this idea, that Bloodraven and or the Three-Eyed Crow is essentially manipulating Euron and Bran, in one case, to be power hungry as can be and take all the dark actions needed to bring about the end times, and in the other case, to maintain all of his innocence to take all of the good actions needed in order to see humanity through those end times. Does that make sense to you? I know this was a bit of a long one. Definitely let me know any thoughts you guys have down in the comments, and I'll be back with something else very soon.